For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Jason Bant. I'm the Extension Beef Cattle Specialist stationed at Overton. Tonight's topic is not one a lot of us are excited about, and hopefully it's one of those that we plan ahead and we actually don't have to deal with drought conditions or limited forage, but it's a whole lot better if we do have a plan in place or a couple plans in place, depending on what happens, rather than to constantly try to react. So the big thing to me, anytime we're thinking about a drought situation or limited forage situation, there's a couple things that come to my mind. And the big things are we want to make sure we preserve condition. And what I mean by condition is body condition score on those cows. We don't want to let those cows get too thin because the impacts it has from a reproduction standpoint moving forward. And we need to get as many of those cows bred as possible to keep those paychecks coming in. The other thing is low body condition score on those cows means if we do have to sell them, they're not going to bring as much money. So if we do have to sell, a lot of times we want to do that sooner rather than later. And that cow body condition is related to weaning weights on those calves as well. We want to preserve our forage resources so we don't overgraze those, so that when we do get some rain, those forages can go ahead and rebound and we'll get some good growth out of those. And if we get in a situation where we're just out of forage and we're having to just feed hay, then we want to move those cows to what we would call a sacrifice pasture. And that's the pasture we're going to put them in and feed in, knowing they're going to graze it too short. But at least those other ones, we keep a little bit of stubble height in those pastures. So when we do get some rain, they can rebound. And then a big one we don't want to forget about is equity. We don't want to burn all the money and equity up in our operation trying to feed through a drought and then not have anything on the other side of the situation. So we want to keep the big picture in mind as well. So I wanted to start off kind of just laying out some things of where we're at, where some predictions are from a weather standpoint, as well as a feed and fertilizer price standpoint. So many of you are probably familiar with the U.S. Drought Monitor. If you're interested in this map, it's updated every Tuesday, but they don't release it till Thursday morning. If you'll just do an internet search for U.S. Drought Monitor, it's typically the first one that pops up. So this is the most recent one that was released last week, and then we'll have a new one that comes out this Thursday. White means we have normal moisture conditions. Yellow is abnormally dry. And then when we go from a tan to a red, the darker it gets, the worse the drought standpoint is. So you can see, especially the western 2/3 of Texas are in pretty rough shape. Parts of East Texas have actually gotten a little bit of reprieve, and parts of South Central Texas here have got a little reprieve with the rains here the last few weeks. But a lot of this area, even though part of it's white now, has been in that abnormally dry area here pretty recently. Kind of an important thing when we think about the big picture and maybe this drought versus some other droughts is, don't want to bring bad memories up, but if we think back to the drought of 2011, that drought typically affected Texas and Oklahoma, and most of the rest of the nation was in pretty good shape. You think about the drought of 2012, didn't affect Texas and Oklahoma too much, but the rest of the country got hit a little bit harder. But if you look at our conditions right now, most of the western United States is in pretty tough shape. Along this eastern line right here, they've gotten a little bit better lately. So a question came in, what is the SFAR? And somebody answered that in the chat box, but the S stands for short, meaning drought that's been going on typically for less than 6 months. AL would be longer than that. And so when you look in this east and southeast Texas and you see that line there, that's just saying everything in this part of the line, for the most part, that drought's been going on less than 6 months. We get out here west, you can see it's longer than 6 months, and they'll just put S and L together there. Question came in, was it better or worse 6 months ago? It depends on where you're at. So part of the US was a little worse Part of it is a little bit better. If you're interested in specifically looking at that, you can go to the website and you can go to archives and you can actually go back and look at specific dates and time. But generally speaking, most of it has been pretty bad. Where it was a little worse here more recently was kind of eastern North Dakota, eastern South Dakota, eastern Kansas, a little further into eastern Oklahoma here. One thing to go ahead and look at, not a state we typically think about from a cow standpoint, but a state that's very important from a corn standpoint, and that's Iowa. And you can see Iowa's already getting a little abnormally dry there with the little drought on both sides of Iowa there. So just to kind of set the stage for you. If we look at the seasonal drought outlook, so this was released on April 21st, so just last week, and this is their predictions through July 31st. I'll tell you, if you looked at the more recent one, this one is a little bit more favorable for parts of Texas and Oklahoma. The previous one had all of Oklahoma and all of Texas with drought persisting through the end of June. But the end of July, at least the current prediction from this source is saying we may be a little bit better. And just what these colors are, you can see the legend over here, but the brown is the drought's going to continue. The yellow is drought developing. The gray is drought eases up, but is still in effect. And the green is drought removal is likely. So part of Florida, East Coast, they're predicting they won't have a drought, but we see that drought may be spreading more into the Corn Belt, Iowa, southern Minnesota, northwest Missouri. Part of the reason this is important to look at that big picture is if we need to try to bring feed resources in, that's important to see how widespread this drought is. Another thing is if we do get in real bad drought this summer, there may be less places to potentially send those cows out later. So that's something we have to think about. So we looked at the current, we looked at the prediction here. We'll look at predictions from another source here. So if anybody watches Ag Day, which is a 30-minute ag news show in the morning on RFD TV, these are some projections they released last week going from May to August. If you look at those summer temperatures, most of Texas, except for the northern half, is well above normal on temperature, and even the northern half is above normal. But if we look at all but just a little bit of the United States along the Canadian border here, they're calling for above average temperatures, which even if we get moisture, if we have those above average temperatures, that moisture doesn't last as long in those conditions. And from a growing corn standpoint, if we get some real hot temperatures in the corn belt at the wrong time, that can have impact on pollination. So that'll be something to watch midsummer here. Their precipitation forecast for May through August, unfortunately, they're calling for below average through much of the U.S., including almost all of Texas. Above average rainfall in parts of the Northeast and then parts of the desert Southwest there. So don't mean to be showing and starting off with things that aren't encouraging, but we need to look at this so we can at least be prepared and plan ahead and then just hope we get better conditions than what's being predicted, but at least we have a plan in place. The other thing I want to show, because I think it's important from that planning standpoint, is I made a graph last week showing the U.S. beef cow inventory January 1 of each year, starting back at 2000. So you can see from 2000 to 2008 or 9 there, we were kind of just moving up and down a little bit. But then starting about 2008, we saw a steady decline all the way. There's the drought of 2011. For Texas, but then you can see the rest of the country, 12 and 13. And so we saw our lowest cow numbers in 2014. If you remember back, that's when we saw really good calf prices. And that makes sense. If we have less calves available, we're going to see those prices increase. And so that's something to think about moving forward. But one thing's important to realize, if you look at the January 22 numbers right here, considerably above where we were in 2014. Even if we look at a 2% decrease going into 2023, which where the weather conditions are, where corn prices are, and where fertilizer prices are, there's a good chance that will happen. We're still well above where we were at those 2014 lows. So just keep that in mind when we think about calf prices moving forward and what that future potential income could be. The other thing is, remember, we rebuilt that cow herd much quicker than I think any of us thought we would, just because those prices were so high back here. Look at how quickly we rebuilt that herd. I know this is a little small, but I'll read the important numbers to you, but I wanted you to see the whole thing. If you're interested in corn futures prices, and that's what farmers and cattle feeders use to hedge, whether they're wanting to sell corn or buy corn moving forward, a good place to go get that information is if you'll Google CME corn futures. It'll take you to the Chicago Mercantile Exchange website. And this is just showing close today for May, July, September, December, March, and May of 2000. We closed today at over $8 a bushel for May corn, which that's a really strong price from a corn standpoint. Talking to a colleague of mine in the Panhandle last week, he said for them right now at the feedlots, cash bid on corn is a little over $9 a bushel. If it hits where they think it's going to hit later this summer, they'll be north of $10 to $10.50 a bushel for corn at the feedlots, which that means cost of gain on those cattle in the feedlots is important, or it goes up. That's important for us to understand as cow-calf producers, because that's going to suppress calf prices. So that's current prices are closed today. I want you to kind of see what the pattern is. I pulled December 2022 corn. So this would be this December after the corn crop is harvested this summer. And I graphed it on their website. You can graph over various periods of time. I graphed it for roughly the past year. But look at this trend since about February. That December 22 corn futures has just skyrocketed. Now it came back down a little bit here on Monday and Friday, but we're back up to close to all-time highs on that corn contract for 2022, and it's at 740 right now, or 743 is where it actually closed today. If we look at next December for the corn crop after next year, so even thinking even further out, look what that one's done the last few months here. And we're up $6.75 on December 2023 corn, which if that holds, what that tells us is feed prices are going to be high this year, but they're still going to be high next year as well. And so that hurts us from an input standpoint. It also hurts those calf prices moving forward. Fertilizer, all right, well, everybody knows what the price of fertilizer has done the last 6 months especially, but the last 6 to 12 months. And a question that comes up a lot is it a good plan to decrease or eliminate fertilizer? Well, on the surface, that may sound like a good deal to reduce fertilizer, but before you can do that, you really have to ask the question, how many cows are you going to keep? So if you're planning on keeping as many cows as you currently have and what you've traditionally had the last few years, and all of a sudden you cut fertilizer below what you've been doing in previous years, automatically that means you're overstocked, even if we were getting average amounts of rainfall. So if you're going to decrease fertilizer, which may be a very reasonable strategy, and we'll talk about fertilizer prices in more detail on May 10th at the next Ag in the Evening program. But if you're going to decrease fertilizer amount now, you better look at decreasing cow numbers. If you don't decrease cow numbers, you're going to be buying a whole lot more feed, and that's probably not going to work out in your best interest in the long run. I would say it's more going to be about decreasing fertilizer than eliminating fertilizer. If you totally eliminate fertilizer, you're really going to need to look at dropping those cow numbers. Just quickly, when we think about fertilizer and fertilizing our grass species of forage, nitrogen typically gives us the biggest return by far, followed by potassium, and then phosphorus is the least return on investment most of the time when we're talking about fertilizing, whether it's Bermuda grass or Bahia grass or sorghum Sudan, or even if we were fertilizing some ryegrass here a month or two ago or coming this fall. Is nitrogen's the first, followed by potassium. So if we're going to cut, I'm going to cut my phosphorus first. I may or may not cut potassium as much, depending on where you're at for your operation and your soil test. And then nitrogen will be the last thing to cut. So we got to have that nitrogen to get that forage to grow. So just keep that in mind, cow numbers versus fertilizer use and the relationship we have there. Just to kind of summarize some things, what's favorable for cow-calf producers moving forward, what's not so favorable. So favorable is we have less cows out there. The other thing that's going to be favorable for us is we're probably going to produce less beef with those numbers of cattle we have. One, because less numbers, but the other thing is when feed prices are high, we typically decrease carcass weight. So we don't feed cattle quite as long in the feedlot. The reason being is the longer we feed them, the less efficient they become. And those feedlot operators want to go ahead and move them before they start losing efficiency with feed prices where they're at. When we look at things that aren't favorable for us is obviously the drought or lower rainfall conditions, the increase in feed prices. And think about, we looked at the corn futures, is most of our feed, with the exception of few feeds, are all going to be related to the price of corn. So as the price of corn goes up, these other feeds will go up in conjunction with corn. Fertilizer prices, and that relates back to corn as well. And so when we look at price of corn goes up, price of fertilizer goes up. It's not so much how many acres of corn we're planting, because there's a whole lot less acreage planted of corn, but as that price of corn goes up, the price of fertilizer goes up with it. So that's something to think about. Is fertilizer is going to come back down, but fertilizer is not going to come back down most likely until we see those corn prices come back down. I didn't mention it earlier when we were looking at the corn prices, but if anybody's looked at the USDA survey of farmers on their planting intentions for this year, at least what that survey showed is grain farmers are expecting to plant 3 million less acres of corn this year than they did last year. So think about what that means for our prices moving forward, and that's likely to help keep corn prices up next year as well, which is what those future boards are showing. Obviously, inflation is a hot topic right now, and it's still increasing. So that's something we have to be mindful of. And then, unfortunately, there are some chances of a recession. And anytime we see a recession or depression in the stock market, usually that's a negative thing for beef prices because consumers are less likely to spend as much money on high-priced beef cuts. They may still eat a lot of beef, but they may switch from tenderloins and ribeyes and T-bone steaks to more hamburgers and roast. So that's something to be aware of. One of the big financial institutions last week, at least based on their calculations, they're saying there's about a 35% chance for a recession here in the next 12 to 24 months. Hope that doesn't happen, but we need to be aware of that. Now, with all that being said, we likely are going to have higher prices ahead at some point. It's just real hard to say when that's going to happen due to the weather issues we have going on, due to the Russia-Ukrainian war, which, if you're not aware, Ukraine is a very high producer of corn. And so they're not getting some of that corn shipped out for obvious reasons right now. And it's really unclear how much corn they got planted this next year. So that adds into the corn equation. And realize with our grain crops, we deal in a global economy these days. So it's not just what happens in the US, it's the US, it's Ukraine, it's Russia, it's Brazil, it's Argentina. All of that interacts with each other. And then we've already talked about the feed and fertilizer prices. So I say all of that to say, are calf prices going to grow up at some point in time? Yes, I definitely think they will. And I think we're going to see some pretty good calf prices at some point in time. But it's really hard to say when that is. You don't want to get in a situation where you're trying to hold on to every single cow and it takes longer to get to those good prices than what you think. And the amount of money you spend between now and then, you can't make up at those high calf prices later. So it may be a situation where we want to be a little more, we take some risk out of the equation. So we take some of our upside potential out of the equation, but we limit our downside potential. Just some things you need to think about. Everybody's going to make a different decision, but some things to be considering as we move forward. So with all that said, culling is something we all should be thinking about. And I'll tell you, if our family operations in Central Texas is a little bit drier than we are here in East Texas, I've already started culling and culling hard. The good news from a culling standpoint is if you do need to cull some cows, we're seeing really good prices for those cows as long as they're not too thin. Those thin cows are not bringing very good money, but those cows that are still in good body condition, especially body condition score 5 and 6, are bringing good money. Those body condition score 4 cows are still bringing pretty good. Below that are not bringing so good. So if you do need to cull, we're seeing some pretty good prices still for those cows. So how do we go about culling? And this is something to think about for every drought. And the strategy used may be a little bit different every time, but kind of talk through some things to give you some ideas. So this first strategy here is all those traditional culls. So those open cows, those bad eye cows, those bad udder cows, those cows with no teeth, bad temperament, any of those need to be the first thing to go. The next thing that we send in a lot of situations is the virgin heifers. And the reason being is they can be still sold as feeder heifers to go into the feedlot and pretty good prices. You may decide that's not the best strategy this year because of the value of having young females moving forward. But that is one strategy to consider. Those late calvers followed by the 2-year-olds, and then try to hold on to the 3-year-olds and the mature cows as long as possible if you go with this strategy. The advantage of this strategy is you're going to get more production here immediately. Your feed costs are going to be a little bit lower immediately, but down the road, because we've gotten rid of our virgin heifers and some of our young females, we're going to see probably higher replacement rates down the road. If we look at another strategy here, again, those traditional culls are late calvers, followed by those older cows, and then after that, a percentage of the other age classes. And the benefit of doing a percentage of those other age classes is it keeps your herd age structure intact, so you don't have quite as big of a replacement need at one point in time in the future. You are going to have a little higher feed cost and less calves with this type of strategy in the short run. I'll tell you personally, what we did is obviously those traditional culls are gone, but I've already gotten into the older cows. We sent all the replacement heifers to town just from the standpoint is those replacement heifers, I'm a fall calving operation because of the winter we had and being dry. Those potential replacement heifers were already behind from a weight standpoint. If we go through a dry summer, it's going to be even harder to get weight on them. So decided to go ahead and send those, then send those older cows, but then keep as many of the 2 and 3 and 4-year-olds and those 5 and 6-year-old cows as possible, just because I want a young cow herd moving forward. So if prices get really high, instead of having to try to keep some of those young heifers to keep herd numbers up, I have the opportunity, if I want to go ahead and sell those. So some options, but just some things to consider. And if you do need to call, typically the sooner the better. Save more of those resources for the rest of the herd and get those prices while they're still up. Because remember, typically late February, March, and April are when we see our seasonal highs for our packer cow market. Those highs have still held on pretty steady, right? Pretty close to the peak there. So if you do need to move some, those markets are still pretty favorable for that. So just some things to think about from a culling standpoint. From a weaning standpoint, if you're a fall calving operation and you're a little bit dry, I would definitely look at getting those calves weaned a month or 2 early. So you save some body conditions on those cows that you're not having to build back later. If you're a late winter or spring calving operation, those calves are still pretty young, but again, you probably don't want to take them as long on the cows you normally do. When those cows are starting to really lose condition, and if that forage looks like it's going to get limited, go ahead and get those calves pulled off. We can either ship them, or if you decide to hold on to them, it's a whole lot cheaper to feed the cow and calf separate. So the big thing from a weaning standpoint is look at body conditions growing the cow. The worst thing we can do is leave those calves on there too long and really pull too much body condition off those cows. Just kind of as a reminder, when we do get in lower than normal rainfall, or if we cut fertilizer back lower than what we normally do, that's going to impact our forage production. But based on what we do with cow numbers and other things, we can have a big impact on how much forage we produce. So if you look at this picture, not a lot of forage out there in a normal year, but if you look at the date I took that picture, August of 2011, that's quite a bit of forage. They managed to cut a little bit of hay and have some cows out there still grazing. If we look at this picture, no forage. And the only difference between these first 2 pictures is one was on the north side of the road, the other was on the south side of the road. So I bring that up even under less than ideal rainfall conditions, based on our stocking rate and our grazing pressure, we can have a big impact on whether we have some forage or no forage, and then how quickly that forage comes back when it rains. So kind of setting the stage there, thinking about that grazing pressure, just going to highlight some nutritional considerations moving forward, and then we'll kind of wrap up with, if we do need to stretch some forage, what are some of our options? So some things we have to be aware of if we do get into a full-blown drought this year is vitamin A can be an issue because it's found in green growing forages. If we don't have those, we may run short of vitamin A, and vitamin A is important for reproduction. The good thing is there's high levels of vitamin A in most of our well-formulated loose mineral supplements. So as long as those cows are eating that, we can get some vitamin A in them. If you're not feeding a loose mineral supplement, we need to check and see what that vitamin A level is. If we do get in a situation where we have to feed a lot of grain to stretch that hay, calcium and phosphorus ratios are something we always have to be aware of. And then the big thing that's always a concern in every drought is back to that body condition score. And remember, it's a whole lot easier to maintain body condition score or put it on those dry cows rather than trying to do it after those cows have calved. There's always a temptation to look at some other less traditional feedstuffs out there. Realize some of these feedstuffs can be very high risk from an acidosis or a founder standpoint. So things like bakery products, bread, flour, tortillas, really anything that has an extremely reputable fermentable carbohydrate source can be a problem. So don't feed these without having a discussion with somebody so we don't ruin any cows. And then bloat concerns, trying to feed things like potatoes, sugar beets, those kind of things can actually get lodged in the esophagus and cause us some problems there. We have to feed cattle hay. They have to have some kind of hay or roughage. And I'm going to tell you, you'll hear a lot of different advice on how much you have to feed. I may be a little bit more conservative than some other folks out there, but I want to make sure we don't mess those cows up for the long term. So I like to keep at least 10 to 12 pounds of hay or roughage in those cows each day. And what that roughage does is it causes those cows to ruminate. So they chew more, which produces more saliva. And between the saliva and the roughage itself, it helps keep that rumen pH at an appropriate level so it doesn't get too low. If that rumen pH gets too low, that's the acidosis we're talking about, and that can cause a lot of problems. If it's severe enough, we can kill some animals. If we don't kill them, but we get some damage, we can get some founder, which is what you're seeing in the pictures here. That's in the feedlot, but we can see that on cows as well. The other thing that will happen if that rumen pH gets too low is you'll actually burn the lining of the rumen wall. And instead of having tissue there that can absorb nutrients, it gets replaced with keratin. Keratin is the same material that your fingernails are made out of. So we'll see reduced performance in those animals as well. So we have to keep some roughage in that diet. And just kind of a way to explain roughage is it's a collective term that's used for forage, hay, or other fiber-based feedstuffs that cause cattle to chew their cud and help maintain rumen pH. Now, here's the thing you have to watch out for. Just because it says there's a lot of fiber on the tag on a feed sack, that fiber may or may not equate to roughage, okay? So roughage and fiber can be two totally different things, all right? So we have to have something that causes those cattle to chew their cud. Nitrates are something we have to be mindful of anytime we get short on rain. And what nitrates do is they just reduce the ability of the blood to carry oxygen. If we get in that situation this summer, things like sorghum Sudan, Johnson grass, those kind of plants can really accumulate some nitrates. Millet, pearl millet can really accumulate some high nitrates. So if we do have some forages that we're concerned about that on, that's something we can test. If you want to look at nitrates as well as hydrogen cyanide, which some people refer to as prussic acid, get with your county agent or get with me and we can get those samples sent in. For cyanide and nitrates, we're going to send those to Servitec in Amarillo. If you're just looking at nitrates, we can send those to Dairy One when we send that forage in for quality analysis. The other thing, just going to mention this quickly, is aflatoxin is something we have to be worried about on grain. So if you're buying grain through a feed dealer, that grain has to be tested, so you'll be fine. You should be fine there. If you're buying it directly from a farmer, aflatoxin is something you have to be mindful of. The other place aflatoxin could potentially come into play is, let's say we get into a situation where Central Texas or Northeast Texas, where they plant some corn, that corn doesn't make a good enough crop to harvest for grain. And so they go in there and bale it for hay, and it has the ears in there. Those ears in that bale of hay can be an aflatoxin problem. So that's something to be mindful of as well. Aflatoxin is just produced from a fungus that grows on that grain. It can cause liver damage, GI problems, and reduce feed intake of those animals, which will lead to reduced performance. And there are some guidelines for different age of animals. What's the maximum level that can be fed to those animals if we have some aflatoxin contamination? So when we think about feeding considerations during a drought, hopefully we're stocked light enough so you have plenty of grazing and you don't have to worry about that. But if you do get in a situation where we're having to stretch limited forage, again, at least 10 to 12 pounds of roughage a day for a cow. And then what we'll do is we can replace some of the hay with grain to stretch that out. All right. That's not as economical this year as maybe it has been in some previous years, but just kind of some rough guidelines there is 1 pound of corn could replace, from an energy standpoint, we still need the hay from a roughage, but from an energy standpoint, 1 pound of corn could replace 2¼ pounds of hay. 1 pound of soybean hulls, about 2 pounds of hay. Soybean hulls are not a roughage source, regardless of what some feed store person tells you. They do not serve as a roughage source. They're just an energy source. The other thing to think about is just remember nutrient requirements of cows. We always talk about this for winter supplementation, but it's important in a drought or limited forage context standpoint as well. Nutrient requirements of those non-lactating cows are much lower than the lactating cows. So that's why we want to get those calves off of there as soon as possible if we're in a tough situation. It's always valuable to know the quality of our hay, but it's especially important when we're having to limit feed and stretch things. So we want to make sure we get that hay sent to a lab that can get a good estimate of TDN using a summative equation there, and can also check for heat damage protein as well. The lab I'll typically send those samples to is going to be the Dairy One Forage Lab in New York. The big thing is, whether it's me or another nutritionist, before you send those samples off, just make sure you visit with that nutritionist and we get them sent to the right place and we get the appropriate analysis for your samples. The most frustrating thing for producers as well as myself is when they call and they tell me they have hay results from a lab that doesn't give us the information we need. And so they spent money and really don't get any valuable information out of that. Just kind of as a reminder, the big things we're always looking at are going to be adjusted crude protein and then TDN, that's our energy there. In a drought, TDN is our biggest challenge. So the higher the TDN in that hay or that forage, the better off we're going to be. Then supplements. So kind of thinking about those moving forward, remember we can break those into 3 groups. Feeds that we typically feed to supply protein, feeds that we supply energy with, and feeds that typically at a cost-effective manner supply a good source of both protein and energy. So our energy sources, things like 12 or 14% cubes, corn, soybean hulls will be our most common. Corn is going to be the most common one for most of us. With the cubes, you really have to watch because sometimes the energy value in those cubes is really, really low. And you can kind of look at that and judge that sum from a crude fiber level. The higher the crude fiber level, the lower the energy level is. Within these energy sources, you have to start off slow and gradually increase the level in the diet. This is just giving you an example of that. So this one's a 12% cube, 74% TDN. That's something that would work pretty well to stretch some forages. If you look at the crude fiber, 7% here. This one's higher crude protein. Look at that TDN, and the TDN's not on the tag. On the tag, we have to look at the crude fiber. 54% TDN. This does us no good, especially in a situation when we're trying to stretch those forage supplies. So it may look cheaper, but it's not a cube that can really help us. And then the cube that helps us the least is when you see a hay stretcher or a range cube, or hay stretcher range cube, excuse me. That's the worst name they can give this thing because it doesn't stretch hay. It's the worst cube of the 3 we can feed in the situation. If we're trying to stretch hay, this high energy cube is what we want, not this one that's really low in TDN and just has a bunch of filler. So don't go by the name. We have to go by how much TDN is it giving us. If we need both protein and energy, 20% cubes, corn gluten feed, distillers grains are good options there. Same thing, we got to look at that crude fiber. So this 20% cube can help us. both of these 20% cubes are just too low in TDN to do any good in that situation. And then if we need some protein, 38 or 40% cubes, cottonseed meal, soybean meal would be options. Likely soybean meal may price out a little bit better for us than cottonseed meal moving forward. They're pretty similar right now. If they're similar per unit of protein, the soybean meal, if you can get it, has more energy in it than the cottonseed meal. So that's an option of consideration there. If you're looking at some more detailed examples of some diets to help stretch things, if you will go to beef.tamu.edu, under the drought section, there's a couple publications I put together back in 2008 that give you various examples with how much hay and different feed sources of what you would need to feed dry cows and lactating cows to meet their requirements or to control weight loss on those cows. Just to kind of give you an example of cost, and when we're thinking about that big picture moving forward, just this example, 1A here, which would be 10 pounds of hay, 10 pounds of whole shell corn, and 2.4 pounds of soybean meal. When I price that out today using hay priced at $120 a ton, that's only $60 for a 1,000-pound bale. Good chance we could be higher than that, but I price it at $120 a ton, pricing corn at $11.30 a sack, and soybean meal at $16.50 a sack. That's going to cost us $3.65 a day. 100 days of doing that, it's going to cost me $365. Okay, I got to have a lot of profit potential on the backside to justify that. So that's where you got to think about that balance of maybe not having as many cows, but not having to feed as much and tying up as much money there. This is just showing you what the examples would be for wet cows if you pull that publication up. There's one for dry cows, wet cows, and then one on vitamin A as well. Just quickly, some hay and roughage considerations from a sourcing and buying standpoint is really make sure we want to buy hay based off of weight rather than bale. But if you're having to buy it by the bale, you better have an idea of the weight and what that means. And I'll come back to the question in the chat box here in just a second. So when we talk about a bale size, this is going to be the width of the bale, and then we'll talk about the diameter or the height of the bale. There's a publication on that website I mentioned earlier, beef.tamu.edu, that talks about bale weight. But just to kind of show you some estimates, if we assume the same density on all these bales, a 4x5 bale would weigh 880 pounds. Now, that's not saying what your 4x5s are going to weigh, because depending on the forage species and the density of those bales, they can vary. But I'm just showing you what would the weight be relative to each other if we hold the density the same across different size bales. So 4x5, 880 pounds, a 4x6, 1,267 pounds, a 5x5, 1,100 pounds, and a 5x6, 1,548 pounds. So these 4x5 bales may look cheap per bale, but you price them out per ton, that math's probably not going to look so good the way most of them are priced. So really think about that, and that publication talks about that in more detail. So one of the questions that came in the chat box is, do most 20% cubes, or let's just say cubes in general, list TDN on the tag? No cubes list TDN on the tag, unfortunately. So you say, well, how did you come up with those TDNs that I had on those previous slides? Some companies on their websites will report a TDN or call them and ask them. If they don't know what you're asking when you ask for a TDN, that may be a good sign you want to look at buying cubes from a different company. But since you don't have that TDN on the tag, the thing you can look at to judge that TDN is that crude fiber. The higher the crude fiber, the lower the TDN. So what we're really wanting to look for is if we're needing to feed those cubes from an energy standpoint, we don't want that crude fiber to be any higher than 10 to 11%. Okay. Does that answer your question? If not, just go ahead and type in the chat box and we can visit about that in more detail. So thinking about if you don't produce enough hay this year, and that's the other thing is if you need hay, fertilizing those hay fields is probably going to be a pretty good idea, even though it cost us more this year. You can't expect to make the same amount of hay if you don't fertilize, so you have to think about that. So what would be some roughage sources for us? Obviously, grass hay is the one we think about most. Standing hay, and then there's corn stalks that we may bale up in certain parts of the state, or sorghum stubble. Here's a big one is if you're short on hay and somebody has some old hay left over from this year, maybe a pretty good investment to go ahead and buy some of that and hold on to it. It's not like it's deteriorated as much as normal because we haven't had as much rainfall. Things that aren't very good, wheat straw, rice straw, oat straw don't work very good. We had some soybean hay that people tried before. Some got along okay with it, others not so much. So we'll talk about some of these other options and which would be good. Things you really, really want to avoid is rice hulls and peanut hulls. You'd be better off feeding those cows cardboard boxes than you would feeding those two feeds. Corn hay versus corn stalks. What's the difference? Corn hay is a crop that did make enough grain to be harvested, so it has the ear in it. That's probably something we want to avoid from aflatoxin and potentially a nitrate standpoint. Corn stalks can actually be a pretty good hay source during a drought situation. So if we get to that point, I will tell you from testing that I personally did on stuff I bought in 2011, corn stalks generally tested out a little bit better than sorghum stubble. So just something to consider there. But there can be quite a bit of variation of just the corn stalks I purchased in 11. They ranged in TDN from 32 to 63. So really, really good hay, not so good here. The reason this sample was so low is they raked that field trying to get every little leaf that they got. They're almost 32% ash content, a ton of dirt in that sample. I'll tell you, most of the grain sorghum or milo stalks in general were lower in quality than the corn stalks back in 11. We also saw a little bit more waste with that grain sorghum stubble than we saw the corn stalks. Cottonseed hulls are an awesome roughage source, but they're very expensive. So really not an option for most of us. So don't be counting on that as your alternative. And they're already in a little tighter supply. Whether you want to call it cotton gin byproduct, burrs, or gin trash, same thing with different names. Decent roughage source, not great, but can be a decent roughage source. Personally, I would rather use corn stalks than the gin trash. But if you can get it, it may be an option. But from what I'm hearing, it's already in pretty tight supply. And depending on what kind of cotton crop gets made this summer, may not be a whole lot of that either. Alfalfa can work as a roughage source, but it typically prices out much, much more expensive than some of those other sources. If you do decide to get some alfalfa, it does take a little bit different equipment. On a hay spear, you're really either going to need 3 spears horizontally or 4 spears horizontally to handle those bales. If you look at these bales, you can see tears in them. That's because they tried to use either 2-fork spear or 1 big spear with 2 little forks at the bottom, and you'll rip through those bales. So you do need a little different equipment to handle those square bales of alfalfa if you did want to try to go that option. The last thing, just to kind of remind you, is we got to keep reproduction in mind. I talked about that at the beginning, and that's where that cow body condition score comes in. But if you're in a situation where you have some cows that didn't come through the winter well, and they're spring calving cows and they're just too thin to really get bred right now, we could look at doing some 48-hour calf removal to jumpstart some of those cows. Once a day suckling can be done, but it's a lot of work for the benefits, typically not one we use. And if we're talking about young females that are thin, we may just look at weaning those calves at 6 to 8 weeks of age. And the reason we do that is to get those cows to cycle so we can keep them on a yearly calving interval. So just some things, if those cows are already thin, we may want to look at some of those options because we've got to get those cows bred so we have some calves to sell next year. So hopefully that kind of gives you some thoughts to start building your plans moving forward. There's no magic bullets. You got to have several plans moving forward. And hopefully we just get rain and the forecast are wrong and we don't have to worry about limited forage. But that's kind of what I wanted to cover. So any questions about that or any other beef cattle related topics, feel free to go ahead and unmute yourself or put those questions in the chat box. So question that came in, am I going to modify my normal fertilization program this spring and summer? Personally, yes. But remember, the first thing I said is if you're going to modify fertilizer, you have to cut back on cow numbers. And I've cut back on cow numbers and cut back on those cow numbers quite a bit. So we are going to reduce fertilizer some for our operation. The other thing I would really encourage to think about from a fertilizer standpoint, and we'll talk about this some more again on May 10th, is pay attention to what form of nitrogen you're putting out there. So if we think about volatilization risk of urea versus ammonium nitrate, much, much higher volatilization risk potential with urea. So if you can get ammonium nitrate, this is really a year, even if you have to drive further to get that ammonium nitrate, because it can sit there if we don't get rain for a while without losing it. Whereas that urea, a good chance we can lose a fair bit of it. The other thing I would say that I will do, and I think it's a good approach for a lot of people, is I'm not going to go in there and fertilize the whole place at one point in time. I may take 20 or 30% and we fertilize that. And then when we get a rain, we go ahead and do another 20 or 30%. And that way, if I'm getting a rain and I fertilize, that's great. But I don't want to tie all my fertilizer dollars up at once in case it just don't get any rain. That way it gives me a little bit more money to go out and buy some more hay or more feed if I need to. The other thing is, fortunately, I'm in a soil that's not just a straight sugar sand. So we're able to hold on to some potassium, and I have built those potassium levels over the years. So this year, we won't put any phosphorus out, which I typically don't. I got enough phosphorus in the soil. I typically every year put a little potassium because those levels are good from past years. I probably won't put any potassium this year, and we'll just spend that fertilizer dollar on nitrogen this year. So I noticed somebody unmuted. So Emmett, if you had a question, go ahead.
Yeah, Jason. Yes, sir, Jason. Hey, I'm up here in Red River County, and I've been hearing people talking about over there in Deeport. There's somebody selling liquid nitrogen, and I just want to know your thoughts on that. I understand it'll burn the pasture up if you don't get any rain, but we've been fortunately, well, we just got a 2-inch rain here not too long ago. So, but with fertilizer prices so high, I'm looking at, if I do 20 gallons per acre of that liquid nitrogen, I'm at about $77 an acre. Where if I do the fertilizer at say a 200 pound rate per acre, I'm $107 per acre. If you're figuring $1,070 for fertilizer right now. So just seeing what you think about liquid fertilizer, or liquid nitrogen instead.
Yeah, and so you did a good job of describing that. I'm going to add to it just a little bit, just for everybody else that's on. So what Emmett's specifically talking about is what we would call traditional liquid nitrogen sources. And that would either be a 32-0-0 product or a 28-0005 would be the two most common. Both of those are going to be a mixture of urea and ammonium nitrate. And we do have a lot of people who are looking at going that route because per unit of nitrogen, and that's really what we want to price. And we have a spreadsheet that we'll show you next week or on May 10th to really help you price those things out, but you want to price them per unit of nitrogen. And the UAN in a lot of situations is pricing a little cheaper per unit of nitrogen than what ammonium nitrate or urea in the granular form would be. So he mentioned that they can burn the grass up, and absolutely, if you put them on there and you don't get any rain, you will get a pretty good burn on that forage. If you get it rain, you may get a short burn, but then it'll come right out of it. So what I would say is if it's going to price out cheaper for you and you feel pretty good about a rain coming, I think that's a pretty good approach to go ahead and take. The downside is if we put it on there and we don't get a rain, we do have increased risk of that urea portion that would be mixed in there. So here in the spring, while we may not get as much rain as normal, we still have some decent chances of rain. I think going the UAN route could be a pretty good option. If you need to put something out in June or July or August, even though it may be a little cheaper because of the volatilization risk and the lack of rainfall risk, I may opt for going with ammonium nitrate midsummer. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir. I sure appreciate it.
Thanks for the feedback. And if those of you are watching the chat box, somebody commented, it sounds like time to cull. And I know it's hard and it's something that nobody likes doing, but anytime we get into challenging situations, you're almost always come out better if you cull a little earlier rather than a little late. And it gets back to managing that risk. If we do cull a little early, we take a lot of the risk out of the equation. We don't have quite as much upside risk in the long run. If things turned around in the next 12 months and calf prices went through the roof. But I'll tell you, when we look at the corn situation, I think it's going to take a little longer personally, and my crystal ball is no better than anybody else's for those calf prices to really take off. So culling early can definitely be a beneficial thing. All right, well, I'll wait about another 30 seconds to a minute, and then we'll go ahead and end for the night. If you don't have any questions, feel free to go ahead and log off, and thank you for joining.